So that's how you can tell that the nozzle size cannot be a factor. But why? Well, let's explain this by a simple example. Firstly, we will need to build a couple of constant pressure generators. There, done. Now, the pressure applied at any particular depth depends only on the height of water above a certain point. So for both of these bottles, at a certain depth, there will be a constant pressure for both of these bottles. Now let's drill two different hole sizes in both of these bottles. Nice thin walls, good for an approximation to a zero friction system. We drill one big hole and one little one. Now when the water is expelled from these bottles, there are two forces acting on it. It obviously accelerates downwards due to gravity, but its lateral velocity is constant, and that's determined by some factors relating to the pressure that we will come to later. So this is now the model. We have two constant pressure generators, one with a small nozzle, the other with a bigger one. Which will produce the faster water jet, and why? Well, it turns out they produce exactly the same parabola, bar a little air resistance. That is, they both have the same nozzle velocity. And just to show that one genuinely does have a bigger hole, you can see that water is draining significantly faster from the bottle on the left than on the right. So changing the hole size really doesn't change the nozzle velocity, but a bigger hole does allow a bigger flow rate. Okay, so we have demonstrated that nozzle size isn't a factor. So that's how you can tell that the nozzle size cannot be a factor. 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 So changing the hole size really doesn't change the nozzle velocity. Changing the hole size really doesn't change the nozzle velocity. Changing the hole size really doesn't change the nozzle velocity. Changing the hole size really doesn't change the nozzle velocity. Okay, so we have demonstrated that nozzle size isn't a factor. So we have demonstrated that nozzle size isn't a factor. So we have demonstrated that nozzle size isn't a factor. So we have demonstrated that nozzle size isn't a factor.
Boy, this is the greatest!
Slug number 1 comes from Mr. Ed Martin. Mr. Ed Martin is a professional fire chief, has served in various firefighting departments. He has several degrees in this technology and 35 years of experience in the field. He is the curator, developer of firefighter professional training programs. He states, "The primary function of a nozzle is to increase the velocity of the water flowing from the hose line. A fire stream must have sufficient velocity for water to reach from the nozzle to the intended target. The simple equation illustrated in Figure 2 is essential to understand nozzle design and performance. Flow rate, the quantity of water from a nozzle, is dependent on the area of the opening and the velocity of the water being discharged for a given size opening. The greater the velocity, the higher the flow rate." He states also, as indicated in the equation Q equals AV, flow rate is relative to velocity and to the size, area, of the nozzle orifice. The relationship is simple to understand when looking at solid stream smooth-bore nozzles. Nozzle pressure translates to velocity at the tip. For a given size tip, increasing nozzle pressure increases velocity and thus the flow rate from the tip. For example, a 1 1/4 inch tip will flow 317 GPM at 50 psi. Increasing the nozzle pressure to 80 psi increases the flow rate to 401 GPM. The flow rate can be varied by changing the size of the tip, the nozzle pressure, or both. Slug number 2 comes from the University of Honolulu. which states, velocities. The velocity of water varies inversely with the cross-section of the hose line and nozzle tip. What does this mean? With the same nozzle pressure, changing to a smaller nozzle tip will increase nozzle velocity and pressure. Changing to a larger nozzle tip will decrease nozzle velocity and pressure. The inverse relationship, the same thing the gentleman we just saw stated, the inverse relationship between velocity and nozzle size simply means that when one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. Slug number 3 comes from Central Michigan University Department of Physics, which states, now we complicate our analysis of fluid flow by examining what happens to the fluid if the size of the tubing through which it flows changes. We will allow the change to be gradual and continuous so that the laminar flow is maintained. Consider the following diagram, which shows the pipe slowly constricts from area A to area A2. From practical experience, we know that the velocity of the fluid through the small area is larger than the velocity of the fluid through the large area.
And there it is! And Blue Bomber's block is knocked off! His block is knocked off?
Sure, but you can press it right back on again.
Hello, NephilimFree. In many ways we should thank you, for if it weren't for your antics, the League of Reason would have never formed its bi-weekly call-in show on Blog TV.